Hello, Westmont College. I am Helen Rhee, Professor of History of Christianity and Religious Studies Department. As one of the panelists on this theme of pandemic, I want to share briefly with you how the church has responded to the pandemics in the long past and what we can learn from these historical examples. In the year 250, a plague known as the Plague of Cyprian originated in Ethiopia and spread through Egypt to North Africa and throughout the rest of the Roman Empire, and even all the way to Scotland. It lasted for 15 to 20 years and devastated the population of the Roman Empire In Rome, 5,000 people are said to have succumbed in a day, and there's no real understanding of public hygiene in antiquity. Since plague was attributed to the gods, except for making supplications to the gods, the Roman civil authorities did little to alleviate the situation. Most outbreaks of infectious diseases were left to the individuals to deal with on a self-help basis. According to Gary Ferngren, a classicist, it was the Christian belief in personal and corporate responsibility and philanthropy as an outworking of Christian concepts of agape and the inherent worth of individuals who bore God's image that introduced into the classical world the very concept of social responsibility in treating epidemic disease. During the plague of Cyprian, although they were experiencing the first empire-wide persecution, Christian churches devised in several cities a program for the systematic care of the sick. The bishops organized the clergy and lay people to direct relief efforts for those suffering. In Alexandria, Egypt, Dionysius, bishop of that time, writes that the priests, deacons, and lay people took charge of the treatment of the sick, ignoring the danger to their own lives. As a result, he writes, quote, "The best of our brothers and sisters succumbed to the disease," end of quote. Their activity contrasted with that of pagans, who deserted the sick or threw the bodies of the dead out into the streets. In Carthage, North Africa, in modern-day Tunisia, the streets were filled with corpses of the dead, and the pagans deserted their dead and dying and blamed the Christians for the calamity. Cyprian, bishop of Carthage, gathered Christians for the whole city and theologically grounded their works of philanthropy in God's love. He exhorted them, both the rich and the poor, to extend their care of the diseased and the dying to the Christians and non-Christians alike. These activities of looking after the victims of the plague continued until Cyprian's exile 5 years later. When another plague ravaged the eastern part of the Roman Empire in the year 312, in the midst of the great persecution, Christians served the general population in a similarly selfless manner. Quote, "All day long," church historian Eusebius writes, "some would diligently persevere in performing the last offices for the dying and bearing them, for there were countless numbers and no one to look after them. Other Christians would assemble the multitude who were famished all throughout the city and distribute bread to all of them." The different reactions of pagans and Christians to the epidemic in the 3rd and 4th centuries articulated the divergent ways in which people view the sick in the ancient world. As the sociologist Rodney Stark has demonstrated, the willingness of Christians to mobilize their communities to care for the victims of epidemic may very well have contributed to the better survival rate. an actual increase of the number of Christians throughout the Roman Empire. More significantly, I want to say that aside from the possible quantitative increase in the number of Christians, the willingness on the part of Christians to care for the sick served to shift the status of the sick in ancient society. Traditionally, the sick had been considered often a punishment for sin. The sickness was. But Christians, although they themselves sometimes regarded sickness as divine punishment, destigmatize sickness and claim that the sick, along with the poor, deserve the care of the church. This commitment to care for the sick became institutionalized in the establishment of the hospitals and hospices in the 4th and 5th centuries. The bishops, monks, and other church leaders focused their philanthropic efforts on caring for the most vulnerable members of their community. Another infamous plague, among countless many, is the Black Death from the middle of the 14th century. Between the year 1347 and 1351, waves of bubonic plague, the most destructive pandemic ever recorded, killed off anywhere from the 1/3 to 1/2 the population of Europe. That is between 75 million and 125 million people. It wasn't until the middle of the 19th century, as the steam-powered Industrial Revolution really took off, that Europe's population returned to the late 13th century level. The church reacted both in good ways and not so good ways. Pope Clement VI came down on the side of science. So in 1348, he began requiring thorough autopsies of plague victims. Pope Clement also wanted to understand what was happening and how to really save lives. The Pope and the bishops eased up church tithes and taxes, and even redistributed church funds to get people through economically. On a micro level, amidst the upheaval, priests stepped into sick rooms, materially and spiritually assisting the sick and the dying, knowing that they faced the unseen enemy that very likely would kill him. Nonetheless, thousands of priests took those steps anyway, risking their lives to give hope and comfort to those in pain and fear. Many houses of women were also instrumental in nursing the plague victims, and particularly in caring for the dead. On the other hand, seeing the plague as God's punishment for the sins of people, the church permitted and even encouraged the scapegoating of the Jews. A tragic and violent spike in anti-Semitism throughout Europe arose during the plague and did not abate afterwards. The random acts of violence also targeted people affected by other illnesses, as well as beggars and foreigners. This overturned the early church's destigmatization of the sick and the most vulnerable members of the community. Rather, this victimized them with blame for sin. So what can we learn from these historical examples for making sense of our own COVID situation? I have 4 points. First, a pandemic reveals the burden of love. That is, the kind of social responsibility developed and practiced by early Christians. What would Christian social responsibility look like in our situation? While previous generations ministered to the sick with very little knowledge of how their diseases were transmitted, Now we know how contagious this disease is, this virus is. And we also know that carers can be also carriers, even when asymptomatic. In such scenarios, following the guidelines of the health experts, such as wearing face coverings, social distancing, and self-isolation, can be the most loving thing to do, rather than infecting the other ones we are seeking to love. The Christian groups in 2020 that were resisting stay-at-home orders or other socially responsible guidelines are actually far divorced from the historical models they might seek to emulate. Actions that put others at risk are actions that create rather than ameliorate future sufferings. They are far removed from the early Christian ideal of agape. Second, we can be creative in loving our neighbor. What would it be socially distant and socially responsible way to love our neighbors? As you are able, consider how God might be calling you to listen to others or speak a comforting word, to help provide food or necessities to those who are lacking, or to share other blessings with those who are struggling. A phone call can be very encouraging to those who are isolated. Consider writing letters and placing them in your roommates' or friends' mailboxes with your contact information. Encourage them to reach out if they need anything. Even in the midst of social distancing, we can safely reach out in mercy and love. Number 3, be discerning of theology of pandemic. There is a theology accompanying every kind of plague or misfortune, because there is a very human need to make sense of such colossal suffering. However, not all theologies of suffering or pandemic are helpful, good, or even valid. Some preacher somewhere might have declared that this pandemic was a God's judgment on the world. However, this kind of theology is a retribution theology like that of Job's friends, and can even take a form of conspiracy theory, often scapegoating marginalized groups in society in a dangerous way. When Job cries out to God because he suffers unjustly, God answers him not with an explanation, but with an encounter. In a crisis, it is appropriate to reach out to God and ask why. However, it is also good to know that God may answer us not with words, but with whirlwinds. In Jesus, God ultimately comes to give us unlimited access to God. So in crisis, we might cling to God. Finally, the early Christians had more resilience because they had a robust hope in the face of death. In the United States alone, there are more than 170,000 deaths due to COVID-19 as I'm recording it now. We are faced with the stark reality of human frailty and mortality. We can counter our fear and pessimism with the hope of bodily resurrection and God's ultimate reign, not as quietism or escapism, but as God's victory over the last enemy, death, as already accomplished by Jesus Christ through his life, death, and resurrection. And because of this shared hope, we can be stronger as communities, forging even closer bonds through the sufferings we face. Thank you for your attention and patience.